So to replace a motor on a Solar Breeze NX, the first thing you have to do is to remove the pontoon. The pontoon, of course, is the gray part in the bottom. Flip the unit over, you remove the chlorine tray, and also remove the debris tray. And you'll notice that there are 5 screws embedded on each side of the pontoon, and then there are 5 screws on tabs on each side on the inside of the pontoon. Once again, a number 10 Torx screwdriver bit. I use an extension with an electric drill. It's probably the easiest way to do it. You can, if you have a long enough screwdriver, do it by hand if you like. Make sure your screwdriver bit is secured on the head of the screw, and then you just go and loosen all of the screws in the embedded screw bosses inside the pontoon like this. And then you remove the screws on the tabs on the inside of the pontoon also. Just set those aside. So I don't actually remove the screws here, I leave them in place, which also makes it easier for replacing the pontoon. So let's get these out. Sometimes you have to fool around a little bit to make sure the bit is lodged in the screw head. So there you go. So now all of the screws, the inside ones are removed. The outside ones here, or the ones embedded in the pontoons, are loosened, and you should be able to just lift it up like that. I don't take these screws out. I like to leave them in. It makes the assembly, reassembly easier. So for now, we'll just set this pontoon aside. So now that you've got the pontoon off, if you need to replace the front motor, you'll notice that the motor on the front side is located here. This is what we refer to as the front motor platform. Over here we have the front support platform. So to replace the motor, you need to remove the front motor platform. First of all, you slide this aside, the LED lens. And there's 3 screws that hold the front motor platform in place. And you simply remove those 3 screws. And then pull the front motor platform up. I like to put the screws inside the unit just so I know where they are. That paddle wheel hub slides off of the paddle wheel. And you notice there's an axle here that goes through the front bumper wheel.
The motor wire harness is glued to the sides of the
unit, so you just pull up to replace or release that hot melt glue that's there. Do the same here, and then you'll see also that there's a
zip tie that holds that in place.
So you need something like a knife or clipper like this. Simply clip that and remove that zip tie. And then the next part of it is to remove the motor from the platform. You notice that there's 4 screws that hold that motor in place. So simply unscrew those 4 screws. Oops. And now the motor is removed from the platform. There's a nut on the wire harness that holds the motor connection in place. Simply loosen that nut. I have fairly strong fingers. If you don't, you might need a pair of pliers to do that. And then slide the motor connector off of the wire harness. And there you have it. your front motor. The front motor has this smaller type of sprocket on it, or sprocket. I'm showing my British. It's a gear that's on the front. So to replace the motor, you would simply take the new motor. We'll pretend now that this is the new motor. So you'll notice that the motor connector has an arrow here, and you want to line that arrow up with a similar arrow. It's hard to see here. That's on the wire harness connector as well. Although that arrow also lines up with this groove or slot on the wire harness connector also. But look for that arrow. And the other way you can look at it is that there are connector pins or connector slots in the motor that are in a half moon shape, and there are connector pins on the wire harness connector that are also in kind of a half moon shape there. And so anyhow, you just need to line up this arrow with the arrow that's on the connector, and to make sure you have the pins lined up with the holes, and push that together. Slide the nut over top of the connector, tighten it up, and away you go. And then the next step is to put the motor onto the gear platform. With the 4 screws. Should do it diagonally just to be sure you get even pressure. And now the final screw. So now the motor is attached to the gear platform assembly. You can actually test if you like. You can reach underneath here, turn the switch to the on position, and you notice the motor is rotating. The paddle wheel hub is rotating here, so it looks like everything is working fine there. So if you were just replacing the gear platform assembly, same process. If you weren't replacing the motor, you would simply remove the motor from the gear platform assembly, take your new gear platform assembly, attach the motor to it, and proceed from there. So now you need to install this gear platform assembly back into here, and of course that includes reinstalling the tire. So I like to line up the tire. You'll notice inside the top housing there's a little insert, stainless steel insert in the top housing that this axle goes into. So you have to try to make sure it's lined up, and then you have to make sure that the axle goes through the tire and into this insert. So you slide your tire in, kind of line it up there. You need to slide your paddle wheel hub over top of the paddle wheel. Slide your axle into the tire, and then you just kind of jiggle it around, but you can feel it usually when that axle is going to line up, and there you go, it lined up. One way you can tell to make sure that it's installed properly, or that it's fully seated in that insert, which I'm not sure it is just right now, is that the paddle or the gear platform assembly should slide down below the top housing here. So just let me make sure that's all pushed in all the way. And there we go. And so you see when it's properly seated, this gear platform assembly actually is slightly below the level of the white top housing here. So now we're ready to reinstall the screws. So just tighten that screw up. There's another screw that goes in here. And a third screw. This is one where I wish I had a little bit smaller fingers to get into here. Or you can use, you have a pair of needle nose pliers. You can use that to also help you install this particular screw in this hole. There you go, got it in there. Okay, just kind of check to make sure those are tight. And so there we have it. Once again, it's good to test as you go along. So turn it on, you can see the paddle wheel is moving, hub's moving, away you go. If the hub you received doesn't have a lot of grease on it, looks like this one doesn't, I'd also recommend before you seal it up, take a tube of lithium grease, white lithium grease like this, and just while the unit is running, actually add a little bit of grease to all of these gears so you get them nice and lubricated before we seal it up. Add some grease to the bevel gear assembly here so that it's nice and lubricated also. And that'll just help to add to the life and longevity of the assembly when you're completed. Now, to finish things off, you notice you have the wire harnesses that you need to reinstall. So simply slide in here. There's little slots that you can slide the wire harness for the that little piece of so here's the wire harness for the LED light and the wire harness for the motor assembly. You just slide those down into those slots that are provided there, and then take a little dab of hot melt glue just to hold it in place in each of those areas. And then also there's a hole drilled through this support here on the top housing, and you can take a small zip tie like this, run it through the hole that is provided there, and twist it around, bring it around, and just use it to hold that motor connector in place. Once again, smaller fingers would be an advantage. But there you go. Just put it in place, and that'll just hold that in place. So now you've got all of this nicely set up in a line. Simply set that LED lens back in place. Also make sure your LED lenses are both in place. Test it one more time. Everything's running smoothly, nothing's hitting, nothing's rubbing. So now you're ready to put the pontoon back on top. So we've complicated matters a little bit because we've changed to a new wire harness system for our motors and our motor assemblies this year for a couple of reasons. One is it's more reliable, but also we were having some issues with our previous supplier. When we're replacing motors, both front and rear, with the new wire harness assembly to units that have the old wire harness, it complicates matters a little bit. So I've asked Robert Cameron, who's our lead technician, to help me out a little bit here, and we'll just show you how to do that. Because occasionally you may get a motor where the connector doesn't match up exactly with what's on your unit. But you can still make the repair, and we'll show you how to do that. So once again, you simply remove all of the screws that hold the rear motor assembly in place, and pull that up, disconnect the paddle wheel hub from the paddle wheel, and once again you'll need to remove the motor from the wire harness, or from the gear platform. So just remove these 4 screws here. Okay, so we've removed the motor from the rear motor platform. The next part of it is we just need to clip this twist tie to free up that whole assembly. And then, as before, simply unscrew this nut that's on the wire harness from the motor assembly and pull it apart. So this is where things get a little more complicated now. You may receive a motor that looks like this, and you'll notice that it doesn't match exactly with the new assembly. And so in order to make that work, the first thing you have to do is to actually trim this off. So I'm just using a regular box cutter. Always cut away from yourself, not towards yourself, and simply remove that. How did I do, Robert? Is that close enough, or do I need to trim that a little?
That's pretty close.
Maybe trim that a
As
little
long
bit
as
so we
the-
get it as close as possible.
Yeah, as long as the connectors are making point in each one of
Right.
the points, we're good.
So what we just needed to free up that connector there. So now you can see that this connector here from the wire harness will now connect with this motor. You simply slide it in like this. Now, there's no thread to screw it to, so instead of using the threads to hold it in place and make it watertight, we actually use a heat shrink. And if we sent you a motor like this, we'll have also sent you this type of heat shrink. So just slide the heat shrink over top of the motor. Once again, line things up so that the pins on this motor connector, or the arrow that's here, lines up with the arrow on the motor, and on the new motor. Make sure I'm lined up there. Slide it together.
If it goes in, you're lined up.
Yeah, slide it together, make sure it's tight. Slide this heat shrink over top of this assembly here. About there, Robert?
About there, but before we do that, to maintain water tightness just in this area, we do want to remove the former
Oh, so
screw
we
cap.
actually remove that,
Yes, we
okay.
do. And with that, we can use any pair of clippers.
Okay, why don't you go ahead and do
Go
that
right
for me.
in there, snip, snip, off, and it
Perfect,
does come right off.
excellent, okay, that makes more sense. And so now you've got this assembly, slide that heat shrink over there. You'll need a heat gun, or
We
a
didn't,
high output hair dryer will work as well.
we did test a high output hair dryer, and it did in fact shrink the heat shrink.
Why don't you show your technique for
Some of the
completing
best
that?
one, you don't want it to stretch, but holding it straight up and down. Rotate a little bit. Now it will get hot, so do be careful about that, but it's not going to get hot enough to.
What about this area here? Should we just heat that up a little bit more?
But still be careful about pointing the heat gun at the plastic.
Right, okay. So there you go.
That's all
And you
there is.
notice the heat shrink actually has glue inside it. You can see a little bit of glue coming out the edges here. So when you heat it up, the combination of the heat shrink and the glue seals that up very well and makes it nice and watertight.
And you can tell that it is sealed if the glue does start seeping out just a little bit.
Right. And then once again, so what you can do is remove the gear from the old motor. And install it on the new motor. You'll notice that you just need to line up the shaft with the gear. You know, probably turn it on, test it. You see the motor's turning. That's all good. Put the screws back in place. And you notice we use the flanged screws for the motor assembly. If you didn't see the other video, we have a combination of flanged and unflanged screws. The unflanged screws are used for putting the gear platform back onto the top housing, but the flange screws are used for installing the motor. So just tighten those up. You know, feel free to pass judgment on me here, Robert, if you see me doing
Yeah,
something wrong.
you're doing good. Just off as a note, sometimes the sealant glue can cause an impediment in one of the screw bosses that we have, and that's just carved out easily.
Right.
In fact, usually drilling it will force that down and seat it more.
Sure.
But do make sure that, like you just did, that it is in contact with the motor.
Right.
You're not going to damage the motor by moving
Right.
it around.
So we're just checking to make sure that this gear here is engaged with the output shaft gear for the motor. Reinstall the platform. So line up the holes with the screw bosses there. And then this is where you use the unflanged screws to reattach the rear gear platform. So there's 4 of those. Simply screw them into place like that. Once again, better if you have smaller fingers.
Or you've done over 1,000 of them.
Yes. There we go. So the next part is put this tire back in, just slide it inside, and you need to make sure that this axle goes over top of the screw boss that's there. So slide it in, you can kind of line it up, and then slide this axle in, and make sure it's over top of the screw boss so that it's anchored there. So why don't you show everyone how you attach those?
All right. This is relatively easy. First off, I just aim for that arrow right down into the driven hole around both the connector and the wire that's snaking around.
About these ones here, do you worry about those?
Typically, no. It's this one. Will be connected all the way down.
Right. So we don't need to worry about getting those in the zip tie. We're really just worried about making sure these wires here are.
Yeah, it'll be the motor connector wires, and if it's disconnected, the solar panel connector that will get caught in there if they're not connected. Otherwise.
So just pull that up nice and tight.
And clip it a little short.
Perfect. There you go. So now you have a new motor on your unit. Test it out. Everything's running awesome. You're ready to install your pontoon.
Once you're done with any repair, you're going to need to put the pontoon back on. So first, I do line up the rear screws to the screw bosses. They are slightly free floating, but they will just slide right in. And 2. And then I guide the front screws into their holes, making sure that I do in fact put the LED lights, which can be forgotten rather easily, they're a small part, back in place. Seat it all down. Make sure that there's no gaps on either side. And commence to start midway. And going down and across. Kind of like building a ladder or snake. When you get to the front screws, make sure they all do go down, and then 3 or 4 quarter turns in the opposite way, just to make sure that it is free flowing. The screws will still be engaged. It's just going to make sure that these wheels are not hindered in any way, shape, or form. So same for left side. These will go all the way in. They'll still be free flowing. And then we go with the inside. So the 6 inside screw bosses take the longer screws. The 4 on the outside take the shorter. So you need a. I've got these. do double check that you have used all your screws. There should be 6 again on the inside of the longer 14 millimeter and 4 shorter on the outside. It's very important that you get the shorter on the outside. If you do happen to use a longer screw on any of the outside portions, you may find yourself with a small dimple on the connecting portions on the top housing. All right. Easiest way for the debris tray is straight up and down. Just slide it right in. You'll see these 2 grooves on either side of the pontoon. Make sure that the handle is facing up the same direction. Just slide it in, give it a nice little tug. That's all good. And the chlorine tray, same thing. The orientation is similar, with the handle being on the right side. And that's how you put together your pontoon.